Melanie Goodchild, Moose Clan, is a member of the Bittigong Nishnabeg First Nation in Northern Ontario. She is the founder of the Turtle Island Institute, an Indigenous social innovation think and do tank. In her work, she weaves together her unique perspectives of the Anishinaabe with systems thinking and complexity theory and social innovations to address our society's most intractable problems. Melanie believes in the teaching methods of our ancestors, in coming to know on the land, and so she supports initiatives that seek to connect people to ceremony, story, art, language, and the land. Melanie has an HBA and an MA in sociology and is currently completing her PhD in social and ecological sustainability in the faculty environment at the University of Waterloo. She is a research fellow at the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience.
Hello and welcome back to the Collective Trauma Summit 2020. My name is Thomas Hübel. I'm the organizer of the summit. And I'm very delighted to sit here with you, Melanie Goodchild. I'm very happy to have you here with us. And before I hand it over to you, I think that through Otto Schammer, I got to know you, and it seems like we have a passion for the systemic aspect of cultural, historical trauma, systems thinking, and thinking like trauma as a systemic effect that's actually going on for a very long time. So we are sitting kind of in a system of trauma. And I know you work a lot also with the historical trauma of Indigenous peoples. So I think we have a lot to talk about. So first of all, welcome here in this space. I'm very happy that you made the time for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
First of all, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you. So there's a protocol that we have as Anishinaabe, which in English is Ojibwe or Chippewa. Anishinaabe, we used to be known as the Ojibwe peoples. And so this is a Migaze Miigwech, an eagle feather, and this is my name feather. So I'm going to introduce myself with my name, my clan, and where I'm from in our language, Anishinaabe Moan. So Bojo and Dinawama Ganaduk, Apijigo Miigwech Bizindawiyag, Wabski o Gichidakwe Zanang Indigenous cause, Wabnung Indigenous cause. Moose Dodem, Bigtagong Nishnabeg Donjaba, Kitigan Zibi Donjaba. So I said two of my spirit names, and one of them comes from the north, which is Wapshke, white. And so that's why my feather is white when I introduced myself. And I said I am Moose Clan, and I'm from Bigtagong Nishnabeg and Kitigan Zibi First Nations, which are communities in Northern Ontario, Canada. So, and I said greetings to you, all of my relatives in Dinawamaganaduk. And Apijigo Miigwech Bizindawiyag, thank you for listening to me today. Miigwech.
Oh, lovely. That's so lovely. And that's very beautiful, because like what I hear you say, like once you translated it, is that you are also the context. You know, you are also the context of the system that you come from. And I heard two things. I hear your ancestral context and I hear your spirit context. And maybe before we dive into collective trauma more deeply, can you tell me a little bit about how you look at like the context in your introduction? Because I think it's very important that we are aware of the context where we come from, because we're not separate particles. We belong to a stream of life and living. And then a little bit about your, like how you look at the spirit names. Why is that important? That's very beautiful.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Thank you. I mean, it's interesting because we don't often take the time to translate our spiritual names. But I think it's really important because, you know, these are my colors for my name. So one of my names is Morning Star. And so the yellow is the color for the east. And so, you know, when I say my names in our culture, we are taught that we are spiritual beings on a human journey. So we come from the spirit world, and that's where we go back. when we pass away, we say we've returned to our ancestors. And so when you say your name, you're actually evoking the spirit of your name and your own spiritual being. And so each time when I say both of my spirit names, I'm calling forth those spirits. And your clan also connects you to a kinship system. And even where you're from lets people know kind of, what tribe you are and what your history is. And so, like, my grandparents come from 4 different treaty areas, 4 different First Nations, all Anishinaabe. So I don't have a mixture of it's like some people are Cree and Ojibwe, but I'm Anishinaabe. So the calling forth of my name calls forth the spirit, and the name itself, both of my names were gifted to me from spirit beings that we're related to. And it's interesting because the spirit beings, for me, both of my names have the word star. So Wapshkie Okichidakwe is Anung. Anung is star and Wapnung is star. And so we come from the star people because stars are in our DNA from the beginning of time. And so our elders knew those teachings, which, relate to the scientific explanations as well. But we certainly feel when we say in Dinawamaganaduk, when I say greetings to you, all of my relatives, I'm speaking to you, Thomas, to everybody that's watching, but also to all of the beings that are here in the room with me. Outside, there's plants and trees and the sun, moon, stars. We don't even have a word for nature or environment. We have a word for land. But I remember hearing often people talking about the environment, like environmentalism and ecology. And I asked our elders, how do we say that? And they say, we say Gidakimanan. And it means everything. Everything, the sun, the moon, the stars, the water, the winds, the animals, and us. We're just part of creation. We're the youngest siblings. It's in our creation story. So there's so many teachings when you take the time to introduce yourself and to position yourself as you're about to speak about something. And especially when you speak about healing, it's very spiritual work because of the trauma that people have experienced, that you need to call forth your spirit to come be here. And that's what I do when I say my names. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. I mean, there's so much I would love to explore deeper, and maybe we get a chance later on if there is still time. But what I really love is the context. It's not just me being a separate particle, and I love the nature is everything, and then how we sense that everything. Because I believe that one of the systemic trauma effects is that we feel separate. Trauma creates separation. Trauma creates isolation. Trauma creates dissociation. And the context is already healing in itself, because and even in the introduction, if there's a context, it kind of comes back and again and again and again to me being connected to everything. So that's very beautiful. I think that's healing in itself, I believe, the way you introduced yourself. And so when we look at trauma now, or systemic trauma, maybe you can speak a little bit, when you hear the word collective trauma, what does it mean to you, and what does it mean maybe to the whole indigenous peoples, in the current context in North America, but also in general, when we look at the world, I think we find collective trauma in many places. So what does it mean to you as somebody who studies deeply system thinking and healing, and on a systemic level too? So maybe you can just expand a bit, and then we take it a bit deeper here and there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting when I started studying systems thinking and complexity theory, and my education is in social and ecological sustainability, that there was a complete in the literature that I was asked to read, almost a complete lack of connection to spirituality, to the land, to context. That's all context for me. And I started to experience a visceral emotional reaction when I was reading scientific journals that referred to Mother Earth as ecological services and the biosphere. And so I was reading a lot of science, and And it really became about balance. It's not about the denigration of science or indigenous knowledges. It's about how do we bring those together in a good way. And I started to realize that it was a process of healing for me as well, because I would get really, kind of distraught at reading about systems thinking and the position of it as sort of part of the scientific, the binary, objective kind of approach to knowledge. And so when I started to actually do systems change work with people, with different groups across Turtle Island, which is North America, what came up on a regular basis and continues to come up in my work, collective trauma. And from an Indigenous perspective, our communities, there's some beautiful work done by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who's Lakota, on the concept of Wakixiapi, which is in Lakota. It's the intergenerational trauma or historic trauma, and she worked on something called historic trauma response. And what I like about her work and what she's, because I had to study trauma to actually understand systems. I realized that people have experienced this collective trauma. For Indigenous peoples around the world and on Turtle Island, of course, that relates to the historical practices of genocide and colonization. I'm a direct descendant of a residential school survivors. My mom went to Indian day school and my dad went to Indian residential school. And that trauma response, she speaks about it as positioning it within a collective experience, like historical unresolved grief from things like colonization and just the violence that happened there, Wounded Knee, the massacre at Wounded Knee, tuberculosis, smallpox. I mean, we've been through so many things historically, and that you carry that in your DNA. You also carry the resilience in your DNA. And the elders often talk to me, especially when I start, I'll say maybe whining, when I start whining about, the things I'm reading and how I feel traumatized in university. They will say, well, your ancestors have been through so much, draw on that strength, because I think throughout history, there are generations that have thought the world was ending. I think Sitting Bull, Chief Sitting Bull, and all of the others, all of the medicine peoples who saw what was happening when we were put on reservations, who understood how much our way of life was being changed through boarding schools. I mean, our ceremonial practices were illegal in both Canada and the States for a long time. It was considered pagan, heathen, uncivilized. And so those very things that gave us strength were taken away. I mean, even our burial practices are different. And I've done a lot of study on grief and bereavement and kind of the, I don't know if you would almost call it the medicalization of birth and death, and how we've taken that out of the home, out of intergenerational experiences into, these spaces where people are dying in medical facilities, and even the process of burial has been regulated and commodified, and our traditional burial practices are not considered legal, in the countries we live in. So when I've gone to traditional burials, there's a balance there of what needs to be done sort of ethically to prepare the body versus what we used to be able to do when we'd bathe them in cedar and the family would just bury them right there, and do ceremonies. And I think those types of histories where what we did to practice healing and to be together spiritually, that was attacked and denigrated and attempted to be destroyed at the very time that we needed it the most, when we were grieving the most, when we were suffering the most in terms of deaths and things happening in our communities. So Indigenous peoples have, I think, held on to, despite that, a lot of our ceremonies, and so many of them are healing. I mean, we have a joke back home with the elders in our lodge. We have a ceremony for that. Like whatever you're talking about, whatever your issue is, whatever your kind of trauma you're facing is, there's a specific ceremony for that, because each of the ceremonies has a spirit that guides that, particularly around grief and loss. So I've found that in the work I've done with systems and people that are looking to shift really deep rooted systemic issues, that so much of that has to be within an understanding of your own healing journey, and that it's a journey and it's ongoing. And people are, I find, and even myself, quite surprised at what triggers us. We feel like, oh, I've dealt with that. And then something happens and you're triggered and you're feeling all those emotions again. But healing is considered something that happens over there, you go to therapy, or it's not considered a part of the process. But what I'm trying to do is bring healing to the center of systems change work.
And so, given you addressing ceremonies right now, can you tell us a little bit, like, what's the essence or the nature of a ceremony? Because when we look at, I believe collective healing is kind of a collective process of us coming together, and I would say it has many similarities with ceremonies. It's kind of a ceremony, and I would love to hear from you a little bit more about the spirit. You said it's guided by a spirit, and what are the essential components of a ceremony, of a healing ceremony?
Mm-hmm. So one of the healing ceremonies that we have in Anishinaabe is a Mamadasawan, the sweat lodge ceremony. And there are some common elements to different types of ceremonies across different nations. I mean, one of the things that you do is you petition for assistance. There's a specific reason that you're seeking some support. It could be grief, it could be a physical or emotional, psychological feelings, suffering that you're feeling. And the Mamadasawan, when people are in there together, so we sit with each other as we let out some of the pain. And there's usually offerings, gifts to the spirits, and there's specific spirits that help with specific challenges. And then there's mushkiki, medicine. And so sometimes that medicine comes from plants, from herbs, and sometimes the medicine is the ceremony itself. We have a letting go ceremony, which I offered on one of the recordings with Otto, and you take medicine, tobacco, tobacco is like a communicator between the spirit world and our world, and so that's why sacred tobacco, not the modern tobacco that people think of, but the sacred plant, which doesn't have any poisons in it. And that's what we use in our pawagan, our pipes. And so pipe ceremonies are healing. And, there's really a very specific context to each ceremony, why we're being asked to participate. We often participate together, sometimes as witness, but certainly you're really there to support people. You're there to sit with them as they process something. So the letting go ceremony is quite powerful, where we put the tobacco into a tobacco tie and give it to the waters, because the waters are very healing. And so there's specific roles that fire plays in ceremonies, there's roles that water play. And that's why for us, our language is very verb-based. And so all of those have a spirit. So all of the plants, the animals, the elements, water, fire, wind, and they all play a role in healing ceremonies. And so you cannot really have a decontextualized ceremony. It's not possible to just think about sitting in a doctor's office and there's here, I'm going to diagnose you. There's a pain here, here's a pill or something. We have diagnostic tools, and they're often spiritual. And so elders will go on to a different type of ceremony, like a vision quest, or they will dream. And when they accept tobacco, they will come back and explain sometimes things that you have to do. And one thing about ceremonies is they usually require commitment and sacrifice. So there's that part of an experience for you. If you have questions, for example, about, your life, we have a fasting ceremony, and that's 4 days on the land without food or water. And so there's quite a bit of commitment there. It's not just, 5 minutes later, someone has said, here's the issue. And it's always on the land. There are very few ceremonies. I mean, in the modern times, we will conduct a pipe ceremony in a lodge sometimes, or in somebody's house. But really, we try to, for example, the pawagan I carry, I was 19 when I accepted the the honor of being a pipe carrier from the elders, and that was 30 years ago. Is that right? Yeah, 49. Well, it was a long time ago. Um, and I've been learning ever since how
Mhm.
to do that in a good way. And I have a friend who's been preparing a lodge. It's a lodge for the dead where we do ceremonies for the ancestors. And so we don't just interact with people that have gone back to their ancestors or to the spirit world at the funeral. We do it all the time, and we do it for people who were collectively lost, like not buried properly. Children that didn't come back from residential school, for example, we have ceremonies for them. So, there's really always an element of the land, of humility, of petitioning, of
Mhm.
sacrifice, and also of time. And when I said my friend is preparing a lodge for the dead, she's been doing that for 27 years and has not had a ceremony in that lodge yet. So that concept of time and space, when we think of trauma and healing, I think maybe we have kind of a mindset of where that takes place and how long it takes. But in our ceremonies, it could be an actual spirit like a mountain. You may be told to go to a specific mountain in a specific territory and lay down on the mountain, and that mountain is going to help with your healing. And that's spiritual knowledge, which is the most denigrated knowledge in Western,
Mhm.
traditions. That spiritual knowledge is somehow inferior, and yet that's actually probably the most profound and important type of knowledge for our ceremonies.
That's amazing. I mean, that so much relates to when I did for the last 18 years, I ran many, many collective trauma integration processes. And many of the elements that you spoke about are the elements that I would say are important for like a collective healing container, like a kind of a commitment to the process that also like the witnessing, vulnerability, and openness to participate in each other's experiences and be able to put myself like into a resonance system with you and you with me, and so that it creates like a collective presencing space, and that it has a spiritual dimension, that there's a lot of information coming in through the spiritual dimension and the groundedness. So I love very much whenever you speak about the context, that it kind of transcends kind of the trauma experience of separation again and again and again. And then you said something beautiful that I want to underline also, is that there is a sense of time that might be different in our efficiency thinking in the Western mindset. So how fast can I get it, and how cheap in a way, so to move on. And there is like because I believe underneath every trauma there is a kind of an ethical growth process.
Mm.
Every trauma comes with some kind of hurt, and in order to heal it, there is some kind of ethical growth. So there's a spiritual growth
Mhm.
process happening in our beings, how to refine our being. And so you said many of similar components, which is very beautiful. It's lovely. And I believe also that trauma actually in some way distorts our notion of time.
Mm.
And I think, we talk about PTSD often as stress and whatever the physical dimension, the emotional dimension, the mental dimension of trauma, but we don't talk so often about the time-space dimension. The time-space gets distorted through trauma. So it feels like there's not enough space, there's not enough time.
Mm.
And and to expand that is a kind of a transcending. So healing is also transcending. So it's beautiful. And I want to circle back to one thing you said that seems to me very important, is you speak a lot about the land. It's happening on the land. It's the land is an important aspect of the healing process. You spoke about the mountain, which is very beautiful. Like, so can you speak a little bit more to the importance of the connection to the land, or maybe not even maybe it's something else than connection to the land, about the land?
Yeah. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. It's interesting because when you're in an academic setting. So I'm finishing a PhD right now, which is an arduous task, and I'm writing my dissertation right now. It's it's inside, it's on a computer. There's a lot of reading and writing, and yet I'm writing and reading about the land, and I even have to remind myself to go out onto the land and what that does. So, I mean, obviously there's the sensual experience of breathing, hopefully fresh air and feeling the sunshine on your face, immersing yourself in water. But it's a very different experience to think of those as beings and spirit beings that you are spending time with, as opposed to kind of elements that you understand, they're kind of scientific details about, what makes the wind. And there's sometimes, I think, a disconnect, especially in the Western mind, where we have this really rational, logic sense of, thunder, for example, thunder and lightning. And so we talk about the thunder beings quite a bit as healers. And so when there's a thunderstorm, it's a very powerful time. And there are pipe carriers that have thunder, thunder being pipes and thunderbird pipes. And what's interesting is that I've found in talking to people cross-culturally and from around the world, historically their ancestors had those teachings as well, but they were colonized by different ideologies around church and state and different religions, and they let go of those as pagan. But there's a real draw for some people, and I've done ceremonies in Europe, for example, where I've been invited to visit with people who have a connection to a being, to an element that's represented on Earth that's really considered mythology now. And I mean, I do talk about this in some of the work I do, once I know people are kind of ready for it and open to hear about it. Because I also can't do harm. One of our ethics as Indigenous peoples, and particularly the elders, always remind us not to do harm to people. And I passed around an eagle feather at an event, and it was for engineers. And it was for them to get to know some elders and to start thinking about technology from a spiritual perspective. And, there was an engineer, she held the eagle feather. I passed around an eagle feather like this one. And I told her about the teachings. This is our most sacred messenger, the eagle, and that this is a spirit. And she said she was an atheist, but she held the eagle feather and felt its spirit. And that terrified her. And she wasn't quite upset, but she was really, her whole world was shaken, and kind of turned upside down in that moment of sitting in ceremony with us. And I've seen that happen for people when they come to ceremonies which are very involved with the land, with spirit beings, with elements that they never thought of. For example, when they walk by the water or the river, they never thought of that as a being and as something that could heal them. And we really, listen to what the spirits are saying, because like you mentioned, trauma has a spiritual element to it. And in our medicine wheel teaching, we talk about spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional. And it's usually the spiritual that gets left out of the equation when we look at healing. And so for me, it's been, really beautiful to go spend time on the land with the elders, to talk to them about systems and how they view systems. But one of the elders told me, and she's a Haudenosaunee elder, Mohawk, Turtle Clan. She talked about the trauma that colonizers carried from their own experiences in Europe, and genocides that happened there like thousands of years ago, and that she says they carry that, and then they came here and they did that here. And she said, so in her work and in my work, we both do a lot of cross-cultural trauma and healing with folks who really don't think they have trauma until they realize that it's not just what they know in their one generation. And there was a question asked when Otto and I did a webinar, and it was about someone who said, well, isn't it kind of sort of sad that we're asking Indigenous peoples to help us with healing and understand healing when we tried to kill them? And the elders have addressed that. They've said there's a prophecy, and there's Hopi prophecies, Haudenosaunee, Mohawk prophecies, and Anishinaabe prophecies. Ours is the eighth fire prophecy, where the world would need to come together as humanity. We would face such a crisis that we would have to come together and recognize that our different ways of seeing and knowing the world were gifts, and that it would be an exchange of gifts instead of the power that it's been, where they've clashed, and one knowledge system has taken control over as the only legitimate way of knowing. And that's what happened to all of us around the world. Like, the whole world was colonized by one approach to understanding the natural world. So I think it's really, a powerful kind of, if you want to say, an intervention point in a system is the spiritual sensing of it and the presencing of that together. And you can do that through ceremony. It's actually a beautiful gateway to do that. And you can also do that through language and through experiences, on the land together. I think that's a really powerful opportunity that people, especially in urban centers, really lack. I mean, I think they don't even realize how disconnected they are from the land and how traumatizing that is, that there's a real unresolved grief there until they get out on the land and see what, what's kind of been taken from them, even around their relationship to food, for example.
Absolutely. You said something very profound. Where people came from, there was trauma. And so that I often say, when we go away from a traumatizing environment, we take the trauma legacy with us in the suitcase, and wherever we go, we'll have to deal with it somehow, even if we have to run away or be a refugee or go away, but we will have to deal with that. And I think that's very powerful, and it comes with a sense of disembodiment. And I want to ask you a little bit about the climate change conversation, I think, or the climate change as a process on the planet is, for me, very much embedded in the collective trauma or collective disembodiment, so that various parts of our bodies, when we are traumatized, we are not inhabiting our body. We lost the sensing of our body, and we lost the feedback loops with nature, with our environment, with basically, as you said, with everything. And I'm wondering how you look at the level of disembodiment, and maybe also the reverse of it, like ways to get more embodied and get more into a way of sensing again. Because many things, when I listen to you, are built on sensing. We are sensing the river, we are sensing the trees, we are sensing the animals, we are sensing the forces of nature. Like, a lot is built on sensing and knowing through sensing. And so I would love to hear you speak about the embodiment part and how to bring the spiritual into the body.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the beautiful elements of our ceremonies is there's always feasting as a part of our ceremonies, and it's the connection to food. And that sensing, we're so disconnected from our sources of food. We go to the grocery store, people don't even know what's in season. And in North America particularly, I find we're quite spoiled, where we expect to see, even out of season, certain foods. And I think when you are living close to the land and sourcing your own food, which is really under threat, quite frankly, for a lot of Indigenous peoples and other peoples around the world. They're seeing their climate shift, they're seeing migration patterns, they're seeing pests that they've never had, and then of course deforestation and biodiversity loss. And I think what that represents is that is a threat to the embodiment that you can experience by being on the land and picking your own berries. And so, for example, there are teachings for us around balance around gender. So women are look after the berry plants, and there's a teaching around that, and we have a berry fast. And so it isn't just, it's blueberry season. There's a whole kind of experience that you have around the berries. And for men, they're fire keepers, and so there's a role that they play in ceremonies with fire. And for women, we're water keepers. And there's also a teaching around balance of that. Too much water will put out the fire, and too much fire will evaporate the water. And so the sense that you feel when you are on the land experiencing systems. And I mean, it's interesting because I've talked to some systems thinkers about this, and they say, well, everybody's a systems thinker. It sounds like that's something you go study, but really by being a human being on Earth and part of these, you know, these different kind of interactions that you have every day with the sun, with breathing, oxygen. And that's what elders always remind us of in terms of breathing. You know, I heard a Pueblo elder talk about, he was spreading cornmeal and recognizing the four directions. And he said, thank you, Creator, for loaning me breath again today, you know, as a gift, and the sun coming up every day as a gift. And I think that's part of it is gratitude. I think there's a really big teaching in the ceremonies where you are taught a tremendous amount of gratitude. In fact, some of the ceremonies, like we have a sunrise ceremony, and the whole purpose of it is to greet the day, to greet the dawn, and to thank, we say, Grandfather Sun, Nimishamiskizis, and Grandmother Moon is Nokomisdavik, and they're relatives. And you can't take for granted that the sun is going to come up every day. And so that feeling of the sun on your face in that context seems to me so much profound. It's also very early. It's much earlier than I get up. So there's that sacrifice of, and you don't eat before you have the sunrise ceremony. So we have taken people, groups, and just offer them a sunrise ceremony because it's so different than business as usual. And I think that's that embodiment. They sit on the ground. You sit on Mother Earth. That's an experience that a lot of people don't get. They sit on benches and in cars and on the train and don't sit on Mother Earth. The other thing is, often when we fast, for example, you lay down on Mother Earth. So when you have those experiences, which are very holistic, you can recapture them even if you're not at the moment laying down on the land, but you know what that's like. My auntie has gone to the ocean, and she's a medicine woman. And she knew that she had to immerse her body in the ocean for her healing. And so she took a journey over to the Atlantic coast, the Atlantic Ocean in New Brunswick, and she's blind. And she went into the water, and she got completely immersed in the water. So those diagnoses, I guess you could say, come from the spirit world. You know, it's spirits that say that trauma that you're feeling and that unresolved grief and that kind of intergenerational, those things that you're carrying that you might not even be conscious of, there is a process and a medicine. And in that case, the ocean was the medicine, or the mountain is the medicine. And you need to, and they'll tell you, you need to lay down on this mountain for 10 days. And you either believe in that and you do that, or you say, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. You know, I'll take some antidepressants and I'll be fine. And those traditions exist all over the world. And the interesting thing is they have worked, like scientifically, the efficacy of them, for thousands and thousands of generations. But we were taught to doubt that through the commodification of healing, right? And so I love processes that bring people together, that connect them and their bodies. When we're born, most of us that I know of, our tribes, our indigenous practices, are as the placenta is buried in the earth because it connects you immediately to the earth. And I think those are the types of practices that we need to bring back for everybody, whatever people had their traditions, because everybody's indigenous to somewhere. And the elders say that. They'll often say that when, non-native people come to ceremony. They'll welcome them and say, yes, your people are from a homeland. You're connected to the land somewhere, and you had teachings. You had ceremonies that connected you until someone told you that was bad and to abandon it. And maybe it's time to reclaim that now.
And it's beautiful because in my teaching, I often speak about when you tune in with your body. I often say my body is not, it seems like we're the same age, 49 years old, but that my body is hundreds of thousands of years old. My body is actually going back into the planet as substance. You know, my body is water and carbon, and so, and it goes back to the first cells, like to nature, to all you know, waves of creation, as you said before. But I think it's very important what you said, that we are all connected to the planet. Like we all are the planet, in my understanding. Like we are animated planet. And so I think that's very powerful. And then you said something else also. It's kind of a, like, it's not only going to a mountain for 10 days, but it's also the commitment that it takes, the self-reflection process that you go through, like everything it looks like I'm going to a mountain, but it's a whole process to go to the mountain or to the sea, and to follow that inner guidance. I think in the Western scientific thinking, we might often kind of devalue what is all the things that are connected to such a journey, and to the commitment to follow such a journey through. And I think that's beautiful. I don't know how much studies there have been done around the how that works, but I'm sure that thousands of years of human history tell a lot about their effects. And so when you look at the kind of the restoration of the trauma of colonialization in North America, when, and everything that you've seen through your work, and everything that you have seen also as the suffering of the traumatic impacts it has had on indigenous peoples, and also their cultures, their spiritual gifts, and many things. So what do you think is a way for us to heal and integrate those traumas together? Because I think you said something very beautiful before, like it's a time of coming together and put the various ways of looking at things together, and find a common way. So if you know, drew a vision for us how that healing process can look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I mentioned there was a Haudenosaunee elder. Her name is Diane Longboat, and I call her my auntie. And she's Mohawk, so she's from a different tribe from me, a different nation, very distinct culturally. They're Longhouse people, Earth people, um, and she was speaking about the prophecies and the that we would go through, and we have this in Anishinaabe as well, that we would go through a very dark time where things would kind of almost go dormant, and they had to, because you would be persecuted if like the ghost dances, the sun dances, the lodges, the potlatches on the west coast of Canada. They were illegal in Canada and the States. And so there was a time where these ceremonial practices were forbidden and had to be protected. And now they're out in the open, and elders are sharing them more and more, because of the belief in the spiritual potential of all beings. It isn't about, these are our practices and people cannot connect to the earth if they're not indigenous, or if they don't follow this teaching, or if they don't follow this ceremony. In fact, it's a belief that all peoples, all human beings are spirit beings on a human journey, whatever their culture and affiliations are with religion or anything like that. It's more around this concept of, and it sounds so simple when you say "Ndina Wama Ganaduk," like greetings to you, all of my relatives, but that concept of all my relations, which is quite common in a lot of North American indigenous cultures. And it has to do with our creation stories and how we were placed on the earth to be a relative and to have a reciprocal relationship with each other and all of the other beings. And the Haudenosaunee talk about the continuation of life, and that, what are you doing for the unborn generations? And so there's a specific way that when you're with the elders, that how they speak about the world in a, I guess in English you might say sacred, which kind of doesn't quite do justice, I think, to what they're talking about. But to sort of be in a sacred manner is to actually look at things with humility, with respect, and quite a bit of generosity. And my brother Keith Busno in Kitaganzibi, he had a sweat lodge ceremony for Somalian refugees because they were homesick and they can't go home to their homelands. And he did a traveling ceremony for them where he sent their spirit back home to visit. And they came back in the lodge. And they said, that's just like home. Like it was really healing for them. And I think to me that, I mean, there's many, many stories like that, but that's just an example of how we can help each other. And there are teachings from Western perspectives as well, like that I'm studying in systems thinking, that have been really helpful for me to understand complexity. And there are definitely parallels in the teachings. We might say it in a different way, but I think what's really important though between these different perspectives is an understanding that healing and trauma is not about weakness, the stigma, that it's not about vulnerability, because our communities are experiencing many psychosocial responses to trauma where you self-medicate. We have addictions issues. Like we have faced so many of those issues as a response to trauma that elders talk about a reawakening. And I think that's for, it's across cultures that there's a reawakening of healing practices, and also a recognition that healing is the process that is required in order to do certain kinds of work, and that you need helpers, you need eagle feathers, you need other human beings, you need other spirits to help you, and that it's okay to ask for help. Elders talk about that quite often. It's like, it's okay to ask for help. And it's really important to understand that, and not just from other human beings, but to ask for help from your ancestors, from your ceremonies,
Mm-hmm.
from the land, and the importance of, understanding that the medicines take so many different forms. And if you just kick the rock to the side, that actually might be the rock that's there to help you.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. And now, since you're talking about healing, like one thing that strikes me is when you said it's very important also to reach out and to ask for help, because even the fact that I reach out to you opens something in me. It's opening something up. I cannot just be totally closed and ask you for support. So just that movement of reaching out or kind of opens a doorway for spirit, for other people, for support to come in somehow and help me to come back to a sense of interrelatedness and interdependence. And I think that's beautiful. You spoke a lot about, like, the introduction in itself means and all my relations. That's very powerful. I think that's a very deep complexity system thinking and a very ancient thinking, that we are the sum of our relations to everything. Like we are relational beings. And I think that's very powerful, because I think also that we see the effects of collective trauma in our medical systems, not only because the medical systems are kind of the immune system of our world. When we look at healing, we look at healing often a bit hypnotized by individuals. And I would love, maybe you can speak a little bit to your understanding, and maybe also the elders' understanding of, like, when I look at the person as a separate particle and I try to figure out why stuff's not working, or I look at an individual as a system, that has all the levels that you described already. Maybe you can speak a little bit to your understanding of health, like what is actually health, the meaning of health.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. When I was in my undergraduate, in my university studies, I kind of put together a program on the sociology of health and medicine and well-being, because I had seen so much morbidity and mortality in our communities. And so that collective trauma, manifests in high rates of I mentioned addictions, but also high rates of cancer and heart disease and diabetes. And I'm a type 2 diabetic. And but I also saw the kind of medicalization, like the biomedical model, which was really, defining health as the like the absence of disease, and treating it kind of purely physical. And then I read about epidemiologists in public health that started to ask, well, where do you live? Like, you have leukemia, do you live near, a power facility? It's like, yes. Oh, so you started to see context, come into health. For the Anishinaabe, we have the teaching of the medicine circle, which is about balance. So in that teaching, the human being is made up of 4 parts. They're spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional. And wellness or well-being is defined by balance. So instead of the absence of disease, and there have been folks who have written about this, it's instead the presence of balance and the presence of well-being. And if you are out of balance, then you are what the Western model would define as sick. And I think in Western medicine, we leave the spiritual part out, sometimes the emotional part. I mean, there is a link in the sense that someone will say, oh, well, stress led to your heart attack. It could have also been heart disease and something hereditary. But if we don't have that holistic sense of trauma, that stress that you're carrying could be a manifestation of historical trauma response. Yeah. But they don't ask you that. It's like, well, where are you descended from? Like, what were your ancestors? What were they doing? What have your people been through? They might ask that for the folks who have survived genocide. That's what Wakiksuyapi in Lakota speaks to the memorial people, coming out of literature on the Jewish Holocaust survivors, on people who have experienced genocide, people descended from slaves, where it's, and then genocides around the world, right, that have been perpetrated. But they get lost in our history. Actually, they sometimes try to make us forget about all of these things that have happened. And so the elders, when we look at kind of diagnosing, I guess you could say, trauma, they look at what's putting you out of balance. And the interesting thing for me personally is through the pandemic, I've experienced anxiety for the first time, and I had a panic attack right at the beginning of quarantine. And my brother, who's British, but he's kind of my coach as well, which is a whole other story of how I ended up adopting. It came through a dream, and that's the other thing. Dreams and prophecies for us are like empirical evidence. So when we dream of somebody or we dream of something, we'll actually make a decision based on that and could change the course of our life. And so that's very different than the Western, so we look to dreams for answers. And so I had adopted Julian, who's British, and he said, it's interesting. He said to me, if you look at the medicine wheel teaching, he said, spiritually and emotionally, he says, I think you're dealing with the pandemic, the smudging. And I was actually coaching a lot of people on through the pandemic. He said, but you're not listening to your body. You're not letting out you're not digesting the trauma of a pandemic, of everything else, the grief of not being able to travel home and go to ceremony and all that, because we're still here in our bubble staying safe. And he said, and your body is letting it out through this, panic attack, which I heard about them, but the shortness of breath and just the whole, and I was running around looking for a thermometer, and because I thought I had COVID, which I didn't, but I was so scared because I live with my mom lives with us, and she's an elder, and I just thought, what if I get her sick and she doesn't survive? So I wasn't even really kind of thinking of me in that moment. Anyway, all of that taught me that to listen to your body and connect with your body is so important, but but I was out of balance, and that's the beautiful thing about that teaching. Like, you could actually also be very spiritually and emotionally in balance, but physically out of balance. And that's what happened to me. I wasn't physically processing trauma. And he suggested dancing and physical activity and walking and just letting that come through me, how scary this time is. Because I wasn't handling it well, and I still have anxiety, but I have ways to process it now, Qigong and tea ceremonies. In our
Hmm.
family, we drink a lot of tea together, and it's a simple thing, but it's the act and art. It's very healing, tea as medicine, to sit and have a cup of tea together. And we've been
Mm.
doing that throughout the pandemic. And now I've started to do uh, tea practice with people in some of the programs that I run. Yeah.
Hmm. No, beautiful, beautiful. It's lovely. Yeah, I think it's very important to see the multidimensionality of our being and find out, have ways to find out the different connections of imbalances. I think that's also very much how we look at trauma healing of individuals, and that we, how we tune in with each other, we feel each other more precisely. And then I um, want to ask you, because my sense is that in the next decades, the way of looking at healing, at least in the kind of Western understanding, because it seems like that in many indigenous people's understanding, that's anyway always has been like a kind of a also collective process, but that we take a little bit the focus away from, we will still do one-on-one treatments, but that I think we will develop more and more collective containers also through technology. I mean, the very technology that connects us right now enables us to have this conversation at all. And it's a great conversation. So I'm happy that we have that technology, and to see how that can help us to synchronize like us all over the world into kind of healing systems. I think that's very interesting. And maybe you want to comment a little bit on that, and then I have some final questions for you.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting when I started to work with different foundations, projects, philanthropists on decolonizing philanthropy. And it's because I run a nonprofit, and they would approach me and say, we like the kind of work you're doing, and we would like to, fund you. And I would actually say, well, we need to sit down and talk about what you're expecting, because I think people have their own kind of mindsets about what something is, like systems change or healing, and then they project that onto you. And
Yeah.
then when you say, well, no, this is going to take time, like I spoke about time, and it's going to, take more effort, and it's going to take place on the land. Um, the foundations and the organizations I've been working with have really come to understand, I think, healing and collective healing as part of the work of systems change. That it's almost like needs to get built into the model. And so, um, the Haudenosaunee elders that I've talked to recently told me about something called a Woods Edge ceremony, or Edge of the Woods. And so a long time ago, they were longhouse people. And so they would have their longhouses in the forest. And at the edge of the wood, before you could come into their community to be amongst them, you had to go through healing processes. You had to talk about how your soul had been wounded. And
Hmm.
that would give you a clear mind. And their teaching is about the good mind. And only clear-minded people could sort of like do this kind of work. But we don't really do that in systems. We just, hey, I'm running an initiative. I run this nonprofit, or I run a foundation, and I'm doing systems change. But we don't stop and say, do you have a clear mind? And for them, mind isn't just mental. It's that holistic concept. The good mind is actually the interconnected spiritual, mental, physical, emotional. So I thought about the Woods Edge ceremony. Kevin Deere, who's from Ganawagi, was teaching me about that, and how they would like to kind of bring that back. And I've studied some of our histories, different nations, and some of our ceremonies lasted for months and lasted for days, and we don't have that luxury anymore. People have to take vacation time, and there's just this sort of like structural uh, barriers to actually doing collective healing work, where it's not recognized, as. And we've been trying to talk to funders about it, and so we've got some funding to do work on something called Mushkiki, which means medicine. And it's like, what is the medicine that's required to do systems change work, both personally and then as a collective? Because if we're taking on something like white supremacy, particularly because I work quite a bit in the States, and with the racial, kind of trauma that's happening there, with Black Lives Matter, and just a historical trauma, and there has not really been a truth and reconciliation process in America. We have had that in Canada around the residential schools, but not around genocide. There hasn't been a recognition of, all of the trauma that Indigenous peoples went through colonization. And when you read that history, you kind of relive it. And so if you're going to kind of get into deep structural issues, what you're eventually going to find is, oh, well, that has to do with like worldwide ideologies like capitalism. So how do you take on capitalism when you're trying to, address homelessness in a small northern town? It feels quite hopeless, but I find that the systems approach, and particularly with a focus on healing as part of that systems work, that seems to be the most realistic, I think, and effective way to do systems change work, because otherwise you are not doing, I think Donella Meadows talked about it, the numbers game. It's like organizing deck chairs on the Titanic, but we need a whole system, upgrade, like Otto talks about the operating system and the shift from egocentric to ecocentric. Well, that is what all my relations is. I mean, if you carry that as a principle into everything and look at everything as a relation, there's also a sense of intimacy there that I think people don't feel anymore. And I think that's really beautiful and healing in itself to, particularly because I think in families, when you think about relatives, the reciprocity isn't just like to be of service. In other words, water does do things for us, and we need to drink it, and we bathe with it and do all kinds of things with water. But the reciprocity is, what are we doing for water? To speak for her, to protect her, to keep her clean, but also to kind of show love. And that's what the feasts are. We go and we make offerings and we show the bodies of water love. And love is a huge part of this work. And it's an awkward thing to introduce to, people that are sitting in a social innovation lab talking about systemic processes, to say, well, we need to talk about love. But that's what we've found, is people are actually really appreciative and hungry to talk about love as part of the work. But then how do you bring that into something concrete? Well, that's where you can start to talk about practices and processes and policies, and actually bring love into decision making, which it's not there. I mean, it's, there's economic factors. There's so many driving forces to how people make decisions. But the elders will say something as simple as, what does that do for the unborn generations? What does that do for people that aren't even, you're never going to meet them. They're 1,000 years in the future. How is this decision affecting the quality of their life? And if we thought about that, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing to the earth, right?
Beautiful. It's very touching, like, what are we doing for water? It's a simple but very powerful sentence, especially in our time, not in the context of the indigenous people, but the commodity or the objectification of nature is something that should serve us, is kind of very strong in our world. And just this simple sentence, what are you doing for water? What is water doing for us, and what are we doing for water? And I love it. It's simple, but it's a very powerful question, I believe. And the water can be replaced by forests and can be replaced by air and anything, but it's like that kind of deep understanding of how we are embedded in that relational, I feel you feeling me, like as the basic underlying quality of human relation. And if we extend it or expand it into everything, I think that's a very powerful practice. It's beautiful. I'm happy you brought this. It's lovely. There are two more things. One is, maybe you can speak a few words about the bonus package that you gave us, the video. And the other one is, if you have one practice for us that you think is great in relation to trauma, collective trauma, and the state of our world today. So I would welcome that if you have something for us, some wisdom.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the gift is a video, Gechiga Kino Amatuin, which is the act of great teaching. And I was asked to take a look at some systems material and decolonize it. That's in academia, they use the term decolonization or indigenization. And when you're, it was about a social innovation lab. And I thought, well, if I look at that, you could decolonize it by simply kind of rewriting it with cultural references. Or I could go ask the elders and the land, how would we run like a social innovation lab from an Anishinaabe and Anishinaabe Gikindaswin, which is our original ways of knowing. And so I went back home to where my grandmother's from, Treaty 3, which is up in northern Ontario. And there's a sacred place there, Kanachuanung, the Manitou Mounds. They're 10,000-year-old burial mounds. And I thought, if I'm going to connect with the ancestors, that's the place to do it. They're right there. You can see the burial mounds there. And so I went up there and I invited about 5 elders to come in and talk to us about how would we think about change? Like, because that's what a social innovation lab is like solutions finding, to wicked problems. And I had to explain all of that to the elders, like basins of attraction, all this sort of lingo out of systems and complexity theory. And they understand that because they understand the world is in flux, that there's an interconnected web of life. And so they talked about ceremony, and we did a tobacco offering, and we had cedar tea. And so cedar is one of our 4 sacred medicines: sage, tobacco, cedar, and sweetgrass. And so we had cedar tea in a teepee on the land, and we did an offering to the water there. And that Manitou Rapids is the spirit rapids. And we were told, before we do anything, we need to go make an offering to the water. And so the video, we filmed a video while we were there, and the elders had to trust us because they've been, like, what are you filming and why? And so they would, so we sat down with the filmmakers because they were non-Indigenous and new to the territory. And the whole process of making the video, and then what you see in the video, takes place on the land, but it follows all the proper protocols. We were filming what we were allowed to film, and we didn't film and those are all back home where I'm from. So it's a teaching about how land is the greatest teacher, and land is first teacher. And so that's what Gechiga Kino Amatuin is, go to the land and ask. And just very quickly, when I was writing my paper for my comprehensive exam in school, I was looking at resilience, and I kept thinking, I don't know how we would say that. And I asked 2 elders, Eleanor Skeed and Renee Mashaki, and she said it's Mama Sinjige, and he said it's Sibiskagan, and both of them said it's the twisting and turning of a river through the landscape. That's how they would define resilience. And she said, are you near a river? And I said, yeah, I was. I was near a river called the Nith River. And she said, well, that river is teaching you how to write this paper. And so the river became like a co-author, I acknowledged the river for teaching me what resilience is. And that is what I think land as pedagogy, land as teacher, land as healer. It's about understanding it. And because we have such anthropocentric thinking, we tend to think of humans as the center of the universe, and everybody else is just there to serve us. And we just call them things, in the Western, like English does that, inanimate objects, like a tree is the noun, it's a thing. Well, no, a tree is an ancestor, and I've spent time with elders who have taught me how to hug a tree, which gives a new meaning to the word tree hugger, to hug a tree and feel the heartbeat and the breathing of the tree and how the trees connect to each other. And it was a a Blackfoot elder that taught me that. And you feel the strength and the healing. And so that might be what the medicine is, that's suggested to you when you're dealing with something, a trauma. It may be to hug a tree. If we're cynical, we would say, well, that sounds like silly. But it's actually probably a medicine that you would never even imagine how strong and powerful that could be, to take the strength of that tree into your body. I mean, that's pretty strong. pretty strong Mushkiki. So that's what that video just shows, a little bit of us being on the land and some of our ceremonies.
Beautiful, beautiful, love it. And is there anything that you want to offer as a practice for our daily life that you feel maybe supported you or you really like? Um, Something we can do in daily life.
Yeah, there's, I mean, there's a practice that I have shared with people that I find quite helpful and profound, and you know, we don't have time to go through all the protocols here, but in terms of unresolved grief, we believe that food connects to the spirit world, and so we will burn food in fires, but we will also put food out on the land. And I use coffee filters. We used to use birch bark plates, and we still do that when we can harvest birch bark and put it out on the land. But coffee filters can be biodegradable, or tea filters. And if you prepare a meal, and the whole time you're making that meal, you're thinking about your ancestors, which could be quite recent. Maybe your father passed away last year, or you lost a child. The grief that you're carrying and the love that you still feel for them can be put into that food. And you might even make their favorite food. They loved spaghetti, so you make them, you know, spaghetti. But you just put a little bit of that food, and you sit there with them, and you have that meal with them, and you offer that out onto the land. And immediately all of the spirits will come and take some of that food. And I've shared that with people across a lot of cultures. There's a whole ceremony, and we do a pipe ceremony, and there's a whole offering we do. It's called an ancestor plate, or a feast for the dead. But from a cross-cultural perspective, it's that giving of love and putting that out. So we put tobacco out on a daily basis, but we often put a little bit of blueberries out on the land, because we're feeding all the spirits there. The trees and the wolves and the coyotes, they're all spiritually being fed. So it's a nourishment of the spirit beings. And it's a way for people to connect to the spirit world. And I think that's probably, you know, a teaching in a lot of cultures about offering food, but particularly putting it out on the land in like a little coffee filter or something. I think it's been helpful for me, particularly around, you know, grief and that sense of loss that is so heartbreaking for people when they lose somebody. But it also feeds all the other spirits. So you're doing something to give back to the spirits that are helping us.
That's beautiful. It's lovely. Oh, it's so great. I mean, I could go on for a long time now because I'm so like got interested in very specific things that you said, but I think that exceeds our frame here. But I want to tell you that I really love the combination of your deep spiritual rootedness plus your scientific exploration, and how you bring that together, because I think that's a deep healing, like to bring the scientifically based mindset back in relation with the spiritual world, and with the everything, as you said, nature is, it's everything around us. I think that's a very profound work, and I think it's very needed in this time. I'm deeply passionate about what I call inner and outer science, having a deep dialogue and see what are the fruits and the creativity. And I love also that you are deeply rooted in and passionate about the healing of the kind of collective trauma of First Nation people and Indigenous people. So if there's anything that I can contribute and in our relation, maybe in the future, I'm very happy to support that, because I think it's very important, and healing the wounds of colonialization is I see as a central element of our time. So thank you very much. And I love also the quality that you radiate when you speak about the interrelatedness of everything. I can feel when you speak about it, how you transmit the beauty of that. So that's really great. And thank you for making the time for us here and for all our listeners. And I think it's great. You shared some very deep wisdom, and it's touched me, and I'm sure many of us will take this home, and maybe our dreams will speak to us about what you shared with us. Is there anything you want to add, some final words?
It feels wonderful. I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and it was wonderful to meet you. And you know, I love the work that you do, and and the conversation to be out there in the world is so important, and that the elders have prophesized that these conversations would happen, and so you're fulfilling prophecy as well as the work I do fulfills prophecy. And when you have an elder say that to you, it's kind of like, oh, it's very touching and moving and humbling. But that's what that is. The spirits, our collective ancestors, knew that someday we would mature enough. I think it's like a maturity, that we were so immature when we first met our ancestors that we were trying to, like, beat each other up because we were different. Instead, now we recognize that that's a gift, and that it's coming from all four directions, all and the Lakota would say 7 directions. It's coming from all around the world, below and above and in here, right? And those are the gifts that we're sharing now. Now people just can accept those gifts and recognize them as gifts instead of like that they're threats somehow. And that's what this work is. So it's really, wonderful to be a part of that with you.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Great words to end our conversation for today. And I hope some others will follow. I really love the connection with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Miigwech.
Additionally, people can learn more about Maleni and her work at uwaterloo.ca.